Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography. Hope you're all having a great day. In this video, I'm going to talk about shooting video with the Canon R5 and the Canon 100-500 RF. My favorite lens for doing my bird video work. I'm talking here in this video about doing fast action flight shots with video. And I wanted to start out by talking about my setup that I use in the field, and then I want to talk about how I've got the actual R5 set up. Comes to the menus, buttons, and all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested, stay tuned. Okay, so talking about my setup for in the field, a lot of my work is done from a blind, a hide, and when I'm working from a blind, I generally shoot from a tripod. Now, there are a lot of video heads out there, and a lot of them are really, really expensive, but this head that I have on my tripod right now is the one that I prefer the most at this point. And it is my old Manfrotto fluid head. I'll put the serial number and the model number and all that kind of stuff in the description of the video, but I doubt you're going to be able to find this head. It's pretty old, but I'm sure you'll be able to find one that's similar, and it's not $1,000. Heck, it's probably 200 bucks or something like that. But it's simple, and many times I like simple. In this case, it works for me. Now, the reason why, of course, I'm shooting with a fluid head is because even when you're panning for video with fast-moving birds in flight, like diving kingfishers and things like that, the drag of the fluid head really helps you keep things looking smooth, keep your video looking really professional, as long as you have all your settings correct as far as shutter speed and all that kind of stuff. I really like this for that. It's got a very short handle, so, and I use the handle, and it fits inside hides and blinds really well. And when I'm doing work with birds in flight with video, I have my eye to the viewfinder. I'm not sitting back looking at the LCD screen or something like that. I've got my eye to the viewfinder, and I'm tracking the bird down and back up, down to the water, back up. Diving kingfishers, for example. When you're actually panning, the drag helps it stay nice and smooth. When you get to the point where the bird's back on the perch and you let go, that way there's no vibration, because even you holding on to the handle can cause vibration into your video footage. I'm panning down, back up, letting go. Once I've got him framed in there and I'm waiting for him to dive again, waiting, panning back down, back up, letting go. And so you have to have the drag set just right so that it doesn't start to tilt on its own. And so this relatively cheap fluid head works for me. Now, I'm not saying that there might not be a better one out there. And if I did spend money on one, I'd be sure to get one with a counterbalance setting. This does not have a counterbalance, so that when you do end up like this, it doesn't start to drop on its own if you don't have the tension, the drag on the vertical tilt part of the fluid head just right. Sometimes it'll creep down on you like that. Not that fast, but I'm saying even a little creep, it's going to ruin your video footage. So I would get one for sure with a counterbalance system on it if I got a new fluid head for doing video, which I probably will do at some point in the future. But it's a pretty simple setup. Again, I'm not putting my eye to it right now, but I have my eye to the viewfinder. I pan down, or I pan with the bird wherever it's going, try to keep him in the frame and keep autofocus on the bird, and the drag really helps keep things smooth. You could try to do it with a gimbal head, but it's generally going to look a lot more jerky, a lot more unsteady. Have to start to apply a lot more, correction in post-processing for any of the shake and things like that, stabilization in post, which I really like to try to minimize for sure. So this little head and tripod system that I have here for in blinds works really, really well. Now, I also do work for birds in flight with video off of a tripod. I don't use a tripod, I handhold in a way. I'm wearing a harness right now, a harness that I'm working on, putting together, and that's the next thing I want to show you and talk about as far as shooting birds in flight with video handheld with the aid of a harness like this. We've set the tripod and fluid head aside, and I've got my 100 to 500 on my R5 on my harness system. And this harness system composed of a harness, a chest strap here, which helps attach a strap that goes to a monopod that has the Wimberley mono gimbal head on top, and then of course attached with a plate to the lens. And like all good gimbal systems, it is balanced. So now you don't have a relatively heavy camera and lens flopping all over the place. The key about using this harness versus just hand holding is you have no weight on your hands or your arms, and you can shoot all day like this, and it allows you to be much more steady, hold things up longer, pan longer with birds that are flying without adding any jitters or vibrations to the video footage. The cool thing about this strap setup on this harness is that you tension it up and you can, it stabilizes things even more. You can stand up with this on, you can sit down like I am now, or you could kneel on the ground, sit on the ground, it doesn't matter. Once you have everything set up the way you like it, the length of things do not change. So you are ready to go in an instant, walking over there, kneeling down, standing up. It really allows you to be as quick as you can be in being in the right place, right angle, right time, and shooting relatively steady video, quote unquote, handheld with the aid of this harness system. I love it. I use it all the time for video. I'm starting to use it a lot for still work as well. So that's the harness system, and these are the two ways that I generally shoot fast action video with my R5 and my 100 to 500. Tripod with a fluid head, or it's on my harness system. All the information on the harness system can be found at the link down in the description of this video. So if you're interested, take a look. So from here, we're going to go in and we're going to take a look at the menu setup that I have for shooting fast action video, along with how I've got my dials and buttons set up. Okay, so we are going to take a trip through the R5's menu system, and I'm gonna go over my settings for my video work that I do, fast action video work for birds in flight, for example. And so again, these are my settings, and they're set up and they work for me for the way I shoot. May not work for you, but you can give them a try if you'd like and see how it goes. So we'll start at the very beginning. Always a good place to start. The shoot menu, shoot one menu, movie record quality. This is important. We can dive in here a little bit and you can see that I've got it set to 4K-D. You can shoot 4K-U if you want. Just depends on if you want the more cinematic, wider look or the more contemporary look, 16:9 aspect ratio for televisions. Right now I have it set to 4K-D, and we'll just go with that. If we move down, you can see I have it set to 59.94p for fast action type stuff where there's a lot of camera movement and things. I think shooting 60p, we'll just call it 60p, is a better option than shooting 30p or especially 24p. It just smooths things out, makes things look smoother. It also gives you some leeway when it comes to slowing the action down a bit. It's not like 120p, but it still gives you a little bit of an option there. So I like shooting 60p for sure for fast action video. All eye down on the next option here, versus IPB versus IPB light. So you've got, I'm not going to shoot raw. I just don't shoot raw. It's just too much to deal with for me, for what I do at this point. You've got these three options. I shoot all eye because I do edit my video in DaVinci Resolve, and I shoot in log 3, Canon log 3, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the all eye actually provides a better situation for editing than shooting IPB or IPB light. So I shoot all eye. We can go back now. High frame rate here is disabled. If you want to shoot 120 frames per second, you of course can enable that. But we're talking about shooting 60 frames per second now, so we're going to keep that disabled. 4K high Q mode, it depends. Sometimes I'll turn HQ on, but I'll generally leave it disabled. Moving on to shoot 2 menu. ISO, speed settings, HDR, all this kind of stuff is something I really don't deal with. Go down to the AV, the aperture settings, 1/8 of a stop increments are nice, so I have that enabled. If we move over to shoot 3 menu, white balance, I like to shoot a Kelvin value on Canon cameras around 61 to 6500. I find that the colors are nice that way. Shooting in log 3 and going in and doing my color grading and editing, it tends to work out very nicely. So that's what I go with. No custom white balance, no white balance correction. Canon log settings, just mentioned that. We'll go in. I have it on, and we're in C log 3. You can shoot in C log, but I do like C log 3 for its really good ability to color grade, bring up, bring down, shadows, highlights, things like that. So C log 3. View assist is off. Color space BT 709. If we move on, no clarity changes there, so we won't go down there. Shoot 4, lens aberration correction. I love the RF 100 to 500. I have the peripheral illumination correction on. I have the chromatic aberration correction on and the diffraction correction on. Moving on to high ISO is basically the default setting, about middle. That's the noise reduction for high ISO speeds. Moving on over, HDR movie recording turned off. Time lapse disabled for shooting fast action, obviously. Nothing to do on that. Shoot 6 menu, shoot 7 menu. Image stabilizer mode. This is the digital IS. I turn it off. I've played with it. I've messed around with it. It doesn't work for me. It stays off. Shutter button for movies. What does the shutter button do? Half press, meter, servo autofocus, full press, no function. Really don't use the shutter button. And we'll go over my button setups here toward the end of the video. So this doesn't really have much application here for me. No zebras, no metering timing, it's all pretty much just set to default. I don't use zebras when I shoot video. I like to see when you're shooting fast action, because a lot of times you're trying to track very fast moving objects, and I don't like anything distracting me. No real application on shoot 8, so let's move on to autofocus. Autofocus method. I find that the zone autofocus setting works really good for me. When I'm trying to track a bird diving like a kingfisher that you see in the video, examples, I'm just trying to keep the bird in that zone, and that way that zone is in the center of the frame, and so it's keeping the bird in the center of the frame, which gives some zooming capability in post-processing, and then some compositional aspects can be changed as well. So I like the zone autofocus for this fast action video. Subject, of course, is animals, and we have movie servo autofocus enabled. It's really important because you do want servo autofocus here. And again, when we get to the button, the custom button setups that I have, you'll see how I deal with the fact that movie autofocus is basically always on, so it's always focusing, even if you're not shooting. And that can be a problem if you're trying to pre-focus and be set for some action that may happen. We'll talk about that coming up. Let's move on to autofocus 2 menu. There's really nothing here. Movie servo autofocus speed. This is really important. It is for me anyway. And when active, it's always on, both before shoot and during shoot. And I have the autofocus speed all the way up to the top. And this really is important because for me, this is what allows the autofocus on the R5 in combination with the 100 to 500 to be able to keep up with birds that are flying towards you or away from you quickly. If you don't have both of these set to fast, both before shoot and during shoot, acquiring your subject, first getting it in focus and then having the camera stay on it is going to be much more difficult. So for me, this was a huge change to the menu that setups and the autofocus setup that made a huge difference in my ability to get decent in focus shots of fast moving birds and other wildlife. Movie servo autofocus track sensitivity all the way up, responsive. Really important again. Shooting stills, I like to shoot a case scenario where the tracking sensitivity is actually all the way down on the other side, locked on. But when you're doing video, the responsiveness being really high works better for me. Switching tracked subjects all the way up to switch subjects. This again kind of plays to the same thing we've just been talking about. It helps the autofocus to react as quick as it can, which is really important when you're tracking these fast-moving subjects. Of course, lens drive when autofocus is impossible. That should be on. And that's really about it. On the autofocus 3 menu, moving to autofocus 4, nothing really of interest here. Let's move on to the setup menu. Not going to be a whole lot going on here. Quickly go through these. Don't see anything in here that's really critical to what we're doing. So we can move on then to the custom function menus. And we can move quite rapidly along here. And let's go back to custom function 2. I want to mention the same exposure for new aperture. Of course, the 100 to 500 is a variable aperture lens. So as you zoom in and out, your aperture will be changing. And if you don't have this set to do something for you, basically keep the same exposure for a new aperture, and I have it to change the ISO, your exposure will change. And you don't want your exposure changing when you're shooting video so much. It's much harder to deal with exposure changes, abrupt exposure changes, step type changes in video than it is in dealing with still images that are exposed a little bit differently from frame to frame, obviously. So I like to have this on for the 100 to 500. That's pretty important. If we move on over to the custom buttons, let's go down there. This is important made some changes, and again, this is how I do it. You may like to do it some other way. But if we go over to the video side of things now, not the still side, the video column, you can see mode is still mode. Autofocus on, though, is what I use to start my recording. Now, when you're shooting from a tripod in a blind or something like that, which I do a lot, you can have just about any button set. You could have the record button, the red button on the top of the camera set to do your recording, and that's fine. But for me, especially if you're hand holding and shooting, having the autofocus on button, and you can see also the asterisk button, the old AE lock button, is also set to recording. That way, if I have a muscle memory issue, no matter which one I hit, when quick action starts, maybe it startles you a little bit, and it does me sometimes, either one of those will start the recording. And that's the most important thing, is you start the recording, get the recording going when you want it to get going. So I have 2 buttons set to that. And it's much quicker, of course, to move my thumb around than to try to press the red button on top of the camera, which is kind of out of my muscle memory flow from when I shoot stills and now with video. So I'm just trying to mirror my muscle memory. And you can see down that below here now, the autofocus point select button is set to pause the servo autofocus. This, I kind of work backwards here a little bit. When you have the servo autofocus on, like we talked about just a little while ago in the menu, prior menu, it's always focusing, which is fine, except when you don't want it to. When I want to pre-focus on something, I'm expecting the action to be at a particular distance, but I'm not going to be holding my camera up if I'm hand holding or something like that. I hit this button, it pauses the servo autofocus, so that when the bird comes, the bird in flight comes, I hit the autofocus point select button, which turns the servo on when I have the bird in the brackets, in the zone autofocus brackets when I'm looking through the viewfinder, and then I hit either the autofocus on button or the AE lock button to start the recording. It's very quick, and I find that it works really well for me. So that's how I deal with turning servo autofocus on and off when I'm shooting video. And like I said, this works for me. Maybe it'll work for you. Give it a try. Everything else is pretty much the same, except, well, everything else is pretty much a non-factor when it comes to shooting really quick things like birds in flight, things that appear really fast, quick action with wildlife. I will say, though, that the manual or the multi-function button, that little button up by the shutter button, I have that set to go between stills and video, because I do that a lot. I'm shooting stills and then something's happening. Oh, I got to do this. Has got to be video. It's going to be much better with video than stills. I just rather hit one button right up by the shutter button to switch or toggle between still shooting and video shooting. So other than that, that's my custom button setup, but I think it's really important. It was really important for me to figure that out and get that going. It made a huge difference in my ability to get good video more often. Customized dials. You can see how I have my dials set up. I am shooting my exposures for my videos manual exposure. So again, having the ability to change your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter speed is all there. Of course, with video, you're not changing your shutter speed to change your exposure, because again, you have to double basically your frame rate to keep it looking nice. So we're dealing with ISO and we're dealing with aperture. Okay, I hope you found at least a little something in this video useful in setting up your Canon R5 for video, fast action video, such as birds in flight. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It's new subscribers that keep this channel going. Until next time, I hope you have great light. I hope you take great images. As always, be safe out there. See you soon.